All right, so we are still in the midst of this temporary pause inside of Gaza, as there was a deal that was put in place a number of days ago for hostages to be freed. You had Israeli hostages that were inside Gaza who were taken on October 7th, and they were able to go back to their family members. And you also had some Palestinian hostages who were released from Israeli jails back to their family members, largely in the West Bank. And I mean, keep in mind, many of these, these Palestinian hostages were held without fair trial. They're subjected to a military court that has like over a 99% conviction rate. They're not given any due process in any sense of the word. And so you had some sort of a hostage deal that was worked out that was basically facilitating the swapping of some of these hostages. Now, in the meantime, since this so-called ceasefire, as some people are calling it, was worked out, Israel has, as I pointed out in a previous video, bombed inside of Syria. They bombed inside of Lebanon. They have conducted raids inside of the West Bank, where they have killed a number of Palestinian children. They have also conducted mass arrests of Palestinians inside the West Bank, to the point now where they have effectively arrested as many Palestinians as they originally released as a part of this hostage swap here. So, again, that's why I don't really necessarily call this a ceasefire. I would say maybe it's a pause in some of the offensive bombing campaign inside of Gaza, but that's basically how I would characterize that. Now, in the meantime, we also have the president himself, Joseph Robinette Biden, who is still pushing this narrative that was basically like a day later completely contradicted by Benjamin Netanyahu himself. And I think that this is pretty important to talk about here, because this is kind of one of the main defenses or justifications that Joe Biden and his administration have for continuing to support Israel and continuing to pretend, at least in a small way, that they care about justice for Palestinians. So here's what he said, quote, "A two-state solution is the only way to guarantee a long-term security for both Israelis and Palestinian people, to make sure that Israel and Palestinians alike live in equal measure of freedom and dignity." Now listen, I mean, I could poke holes in so much of this, right? Palestinians and Israelis, living alike in equal measure of freedom and dignity. Maybe step one would be dismantling the Israeli apartheid and not being in favor of a Jewish ethno-state in the region that involves the mass, ethnic cleansing of Palestinians. Okay, but we can skip past that. Let's focus on the two-state solution here, right? So this is something that has been a matter of U.S. official policy for decades and decades and decades at this point, as Israel is continuing with their apartheid policies, as Israel is continuing with a slow-rolling ethnic cleansing of the Palestinian people, continuing to expand their entirely illegal settlements under international law, and displacing Palestinians by the thousands, right? So it's kind of a contradiction just in that sense, in terms of what official Israeli policy has been over the last number of decades, but also it's ramped up significantly under Benjamin Netanyahu. So, I mean, it doesn't really make sense at this point, at least in my opinion, to be continuing to pretend as if a two-state solution is on the table, number one, in terms of a logistical sense, because the West Bank has been fragmented into a million different, enclaves and neighborhoods that are separated from one another. I mean, the idea of creating a continuous Palestinian state with over 500,000 roughly Israeli settlers that are living on stolen Palestinian land inside of this territory, like the idea that you're going to be able to create a Palestinian state and, somehow connect that with the Palestinians in Gaza. I mean, it just logistically, it's an absolute nightmare and really doesn't make any feasible sense. But then on top of that, you have the political angle, right? Which is that Israel, especially under Benjamin Netanyahu and the most far-right coalition in the history of this country, you also have this part, which is that politically, Israel has absolutely no interest whatsoever in pushing for a two-state solution. In fact, we had this that just came out the other day. Netanyahu reportedly makes his case of survival to Likud members by promising to stand up to the Biden administration on the day after this war eventually ends, saying, quote, "I'm the only one who will prevent a Palestinian state. The U.S. was against the ground operation." So, I mean, look at what he's saying here, right? Number one, he's admitting that the ideas Joe Biden is pointing out here of a two-state solution is not something he's even remotely considering, right? This is completely off the table. It's non-negotiable. This is not even part of his discussion for the future of Gaza, for the future of Palestinians in the West Bank. Really what they want to do is conquer the entirety of what they call Judea and Samaria, right? Which is the entirety of this Palestinian land. But I mean, think about the concept of him standing up to Biden on the day after the war. What does he mean by standing up to Biden? Biden could not, I can't even imagine a way in which Joe Biden could have physically been more of a pathetic, groveling idiot for the Israeli government during this entire offensive into Gaza. He has said openly, members of his administration like John Kirby have said openly numerous times, there are no red lines for Israel. We stand with Israel. We will, unleash the American weaponry to Israel. In fact, just the other day, I covered that story of the Biden administration loosening the restrictions on supplying weapons to Israel. He has not uttered a single word of actual valid critique of Israel's operations in Gaza, even as they have slaughtered thousands and thousands of innocent men, women, and children. They bomb mosques and UN shelters and schools and refugee camps and churches and all of that. They have not even put the mildest amount of public pressure on Israel. Now, maybe you could turn around and say, okay, behind the scenes, they're doing something and pushing them to not commit a total genocide. Okay, whatever. If we're actually looking at this in a real way, the Biden administration has not put even the tiniest fraction of political pressure on Benjamin Netanyahu that they have the power to actually do and to wield. And yet, Netanyahu is still saying, I'm the guy who's going to stand up to Biden, meaning I'm going to be even more extreme to the point that even if I get to such an extreme point that Joe Biden has to call out what I'm doing on the ground, I'm still going to be the one that stands up to him and stands against the possibility of a Palestinian state. And he obviously references the U.S. being against the ground invasion, and okay, we went ahead with the ground invasion, and yada yada yada. So I mean, again, the idea that this two-state solution that's being floated is on the table, it's completely delusional at this point. Again, I don't think it's logistically possible. I don't think it's politically possible. Now, you could turn around and you could say that, the thing that I'm in favor of, that I think that many people around the world are in favor of, which is a one-state solution with full democratic and civil rights for everybody, whether you're Jewish or Christian or Muslim or atheist or you are Palestinian or you're from anywhere, right? Having full rights for everybody living in this area, I think that's the best solution moving forward. You could turn around and you could say, well, that's equally as impossible as a two-state solution. Maybe so. I mean, it's an incredibly difficult situation where the political solutions are not easy to work out without an incredible amount of pressure from the global community bearing down on the government of Israel to change the fundamental reality of what they are doing right now. I think it's all going to be difficult, but continuing to pretend as if like the Benjamin Netanyahu government is in favor of eventually creating a two-state solution, I mean, it's just completely ridiculous, right? Now, we also had this tweet that I wanted to mention. Joe Biden came out just yesterday and he said this: Hamas unleashed a terrorist attack because they fear nothing more than Israelis and Palestinians living side by side in peace. To continue down the path of terror, violence, killing, and war is to give Hamas what they seek. We can't do that. So, I mean, this is just such a convoluted tweet here. If what you wanted to say is that Israel should not continue to flatten Gaza into oblivion because that's not going to produce a stable, viable path towards peace for the future, then you could have just said that. You could have just said, we should have a ceasefire. You could have just openly called on Benjamin Netanyahu to end the offensive into Gaza. I mean, you could just come out and say that. He does it in this really convoluted way where he's saying, like, Israel is actually doing the bidding of Hamas because the more that Israel attacks Hamas, the more that Palestinians are going to be radicalized maybe, and they're going to side with Hamas, and it's just going to feed into what Hamas's agenda is. Like, okay, sure, to some extent, but, like, why don't you just come out and say it? Instead of giving this, like, half-assed, back-worded way of going about this. So this is what he said. And then even this tweet, right, which I think didn't even go far enough, it definitely wasn't clear enough to make like a coherent message for the world available. He even walked this back. Hear from Josh, more from the White House on the tweet that was released. Now again, I mean, keep in mind, Joe Biden doesn't know how to operate Twitter. So this was released by probably one of his staffers or something, right? So they had to come out and they clarified it, right? They said, he meant that we can't lose hope for peace. Ultimately, in the region, that it's still incredibly important that we continue to lay the groundwork for and create the conditions for a lasting peace, and that involves a two-state solution. So he walked back even that mild, half-assed, vague, incoherent tweet that he just posted there. He meant that we can't lose hope for peace. So, I mean, like, this is what some people, like, I legitimately do see some liberals, even some conservatives, but mostly liberals, who come out and they make arguments like, well, you don't know what Joe Biden's doing behind the scenes. Like, he's working out ways to get more humanitarian aid into Gaza, and he made it so that the invasion force into Gaza wasn't as large as it otherwise would have been, and he's reminding them, like, behind the scenes to please don't kill as many innocent Palestinian children, shit like that, basically. But, I mean, look, if you're walking back a tweet like this and basically just summarizing it as like, we hope for peace in the future, with absolutely no specifics, with no legitimate public pressure on Israel to end the slaughter of Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank for that matter, or to end the expansions of illegal settlements into the West Bank. Now, Joe Biden, to be fair, did say that he was considering sanctions on, I think, individual Israeli settlers in the West Bank. So that's a somewhat, right move in the right direction. But if you're not willing to leverage the biggest piece of leverage, the biggest point of leverage that Israel has, or that the United States has over Israel, which would be our military aid that we give to them on an annual basis, $3.8 billion that we give to them, and now there's packages moving through the House and the Senate that are significantly more than that, multiple times more than that, to aid and abet inside of their war in Gaza, then, I mean, what are you really doing? You're not applying pressure. You're not even going 1% of the way that you possibly could in order to end this. So it's like, the policy here is incoherent, okay? And I think that that's partly because Joe Biden, his administration, his staffers around him, his PR people, all of that, they see the polling data, right? They see young people turning against him saying, fuck this shit. You're going to back the genocidal campaign by Israel in Gaza. We're not going to support you. They see the polling data from Arab Americans, especially in key swing states like Michigan, for example, of Arab Americans turning against him. I think they see and they feel a lot of the public pressure, okay? And so this is sort of their way to talk out of both sides of their mouth and to pretend as if they legitimately care about a long-term path to peace, and to pretend as if they care about the humanitarian catastrophe that's happening in Gaza right now, while simultaneously continuing to give weapons to Israel, continuing to give diplomatic cover to Israel, both in like the public press and also at the United Nations, for example. And so they really, I mean, if you get cut down to the core of it, we understand what Joe Biden's agenda is here, right? He can do all the PR work in the world that he wants to do. It's not going to change the fundamental reality of what Israel is doing right now in Gaza. Now, we also have this interesting part of it from the Times of Israel, which is basically showing some sort of like cracks in the Benjamin Netanyahu coalition here. So we have, again, from the Times of Israel, Itamar Ben-Gvir, threatens to tear down the government if war is not resumed. Okay, so Benjamin Netanyahu, in order to come to power in this most recent, power grab, as he was facing massive corruption allegations and all of that stuff and was potentially going to face some sort of like consequences for that, he formed this coalition government to allow himself to become the prime minister with these insane far right, in the case of Itamar Ben-Gvir, like convicted terrorist sympathizers, right? This guy's been convicted, I think, on 8 different charges, some involving incitement of terrorism. This was a guy who was so extreme and so racist that he was not allowed to serve in the IDF, okay, which is kind of like being too racist and too extreme to not be allowed to be a police officer in like the 1940s segregated South in the United States. So like that's how extreme this guy is. And he's now the national security minister. And him and a couple of these other far-right ghouls within Netanyahu's coalition that brought him to power in the first place are basically saying like, we don't want you to do these deals with Hamas. We would rather continue to bomb Gaza into oblivion, even if we risk killing our own Israeli civilians that are being held hostage in Gaza, rather than work out some sort of deals with Hamas to bring the hostages home. Now, it's already been demonstrated that, yeah, these hostages are alive, right, for the most part. I mean, I'm sure some of them have died. We've had reports that some of them have died from Israeli bombing already, but we've already seen a demonstration that Hamas can get some of these terrorists or some of these hostages. They can give them over to the Red Cross. The Red Cross can bring them back over to Israel, and then they can, bring them back to their families and all that. We've seen this demonstrated at this point, so we know that that's possible. Okay, you can't use the argument of like Hamas is this, rabidly evil terrorist organization that nobody could even potentially talk to. You can talk to them. You can work out some sort of internationally led deals with them to get the hostages back. And yet we have members of Benjamin Netanyahu's own coalition who brought him to power who are saying, we don't want that. We want you to continue bombing Gaza into oblivion, or else we are not going to support you anymore. Now, as I pointed out in this article, he is also currently being held up, Netanyahu, by a coalition government that was formed in the aftermath of October 7th, with guys like Benny Gantz, for example. And so they sort of have like a unity party that's in place right now. So even if guys like Ben-Gvir or Bezalel Smotrich like turned against Netanyahu right now, he could still technically remain in power. Now, if Ben-Gvir and other far-right members of their own party, turned against Netanyahu, then maybe the rest of the coalition falls apart as well, this unity coalition, and maybe Benjamin Netanyahu is replaced after that or something. But, as of right now, it doesn't look like he's like immediately about to be displaced from power or something like that. But I think it is just important to remind people of who some of the most powerful people are within Benjamin Netanyahu's coalition. Guys like Itamar Ben-Gvir and, again, Bezalel Smotrich and the rest of these motherfuckers. Not that even like the so-called liberal alternatives are even that much better than Netanyahu. But, I mean, there you have it. Listen, again, we got Joe Biden pretending to care about the possibility of a two-state solution, even though I think at this point every reasonable person knows that this is not really on the table right now or even into the foreseeable future. We have Benjamin Netanyahu coming out, basically dick slapping him in the face and saying, you should keep me in power because I'm the only guy who can stand up to Biden and prevent a Palestinian state. And you still have Joe Biden basically talking out of both sides of his mouth while he continues to give weapons and diplomatic cover to Israel to continue their onslaught. So, I mean, the statistics that I've seen over the last couple of days coming out of Gaza have been absolutely abysmal. I showed you guys some of the footage of what it looks like on the ground right now. I've seen other reports that I can't necessarily bring to you guys yet because they haven't been confirmed 100% yet. But over the next couple of days, I'll certainly continue to update you guys on what is happening on the ground and if there's any updates on this hostage deal or this hostage swap and the truce that is currently in place. But again, I mean, it's not as if this is some sort of a long-term solution. I wish it was, but it's just not. I mean, we saw what some of the heads of the Israeli military were saying just a couple of days ago. Yoav Gallant, for example, the Minister of Defense, who was basically coming out and saying, as soon as this truce ends, as soon as we get some of the hostages back, we are going to go in and bomb Gaza with the intensity that they haven't seen up until this point, which is absolutely astonishing, given the fact that there was like a month-long period during the bombing of Gaza where they dropped more bombs than the United States did in the heaviest year of bombing in Afghanistan during our 2 decades-long war there. I mean, the amount of human suffering that is currently unfolding in Gaza, not just with the bombs, but also with people being displaced from their homes, having their families ripped apart, the possibility that is continuing to encroach of diseases spreading as people are getting forced into tighter and tighter areas with less and less supplies and less, access to things like reliable food and clean drinking water and all of that. I mean, this is an absolute nightmare of biblical proportions, and it looks like our government, for the most part, is still standing firmly behind this.
Everyone is saying good politic guy has the best politic. Believe me, no one does it like him. Believe me, everyone is saying